What are you more afraid of? A terrorist attack or diabetes? Which is more dangerous? Which is more likely to occur? Often our fears are barely related to actual danger, but all the more so to the availability bias. And today we will find out about that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung, and today we will discuss another bias or fallacy, this time the availability bias. This is one of the most basic, most fundamental, and most important biases. It was discovered by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who published an article about it in 1973. So, how does it work? Recall my initial question about terrorism and diabetes. What do we do in such a situation? Now, most of us don't have detailed statistics on their mind, so we are pretty much dumbfounded, we are pretty much clueless. However, this happens way less frequently than it should. We are not clueless very often, and the reason is that our mind works around such situations. We rely on heuristics, on rules of thumb. For example, if we don't know the answer to a complicated question, we just answer an easier one instead. We might not know how frequent terrorist attacks or death by diabetes occur, but we know how easily we can come up with examples for those. And that we use as an indication of how frequently those two occur. And of course, this is a highly problematic heuristic that is often wrong. Daniel Kahneman points out that there are several factors that influence how easily we can come up with examples for something. For example, we will always come up way more easily for examples for dramatic events because they are more present, more vivid in our minds. Furthermore, dramatic events will also make related events more present to us. For example, if I see a report of a plane crash on the news, this will also bring up memories of different types of accidents, and the whole world will feel less safe for a while. And obviously, I will more easily remember my personal experiences than things that happen to friends or family. And things that happen to friends or family will come up way easier than things that happen to strangers. So the availability bias or availability heuristic can easily be led astray. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman did so in a couple of studies they performed. They used simple experiments, simple games to try out this availability bias. For example, they asked participants in a study in the English language, is the letter K more likely to occur in the first position within a word or in the third position? Now, actually, the letter K appears way more frequently in the third position. However, it is way easier to come up with words that start with K than with words where K is in the third position. So the participants said, well, okay, it is more likely to occur at the beginning of the word, way more likely than in the third position, and the opposite is true. And they performed various experiments like this one, where they led people astray by especially targeting this availability bias. One question remained, however. What exactly is the important factor here? Is it the ease of remembering, or is it the number of examples we can come up with? And this was there was a research done about this, by a group of German psychologists led by Norbert Schwarz. They performed an experiment where they asked participants to come up with examples for situations where they had been assertive, where they had acted assertively. And then they were asked to rate on a scale how assertive they were overall, how assertive they believed themselves to be. Some participants they asked to come up with 6 examples. Other participants they asked for 12. Now obviously if you have to come up with 12 examples, you will end up with more total examples in the end, but it will be way more difficult because after you have collected 6, it will be quite difficult. 7, 8, and it will be, in the end, it will be quite difficult to come up with further examples. And the result was those people who were only asked for 6 examples rated themselves way more assertive than those who were asked for 12 examples. So the ease of remembering is more important than the number of examples. Now, as I said before, this heuristic doesn't always work well. The ease of us coming up with examples is often not a good indicator of how frequent and likely certain events are to occur. And this is especially true when dealing with the media, because the media pretty much works the other way around. In the media, we get reports of things that are extraordinary, that are rare, that are special. We don't get information about things that occur frequently, that are commonplace. And there is a great example for that in the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling. We had a book review of this a while ago. As you might recall, it is a book about misconceptions we have about the world, about the fact that we often see the world not as it really is. So it is not a book specifically about biases and fallacies, but it deals with a very similar topic, and Rosling also discusses the issue of the media. And he has a great example concerning October 17th, 2004 in Sweden, because on that day 2 people died. The first was Marie Larsson, 38 years old, mother of 3 children. She was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, who had broken into her apartment and waited for her there, and he killed her with multiple blows to her head with an axe. And this gruesome murder was barely mentioned in the media. On the same day, Johan Westerlund, 40 years old, father of 3 children, was killed as well, and he died in on a hunting trip where he was killed by a bear. And this was all over the media, all over the news. Because a human being killed by a bear is something extraordinary, something that happens once every 100 years. Before this case in 2004, the last reported case in Sweden was 1902. So this was all over the news. On the other hand, a woman being killed by an ex-boyfriend, this happens about once every 30 days. This is commonplace, so this was barely reported. So if we look at the media, the impression of dangers and risks we get is quite contrary to what is actually true. And this is especially obvious if we consider the aforementioned terrorism, which is also presented as an example by Rosling. Because in the US, in surveys, about 50% of people say that they are afraid a loved one will be killed in a terrorist attack. Now, how likely is this actually? In the US, more than 3,000 people were killed in terrorist attacks over 20 years, up to 2015, 2016. So this includes the terror attack of 9/11. Now, if we look at people who are killed by drunkards, for example, in accidents caused by drunk people or homicide by people who are drunk, we get more than 7,000 deaths in a single year. So it is about 50 times more likely that a loved one is killed by a person who is drunk than by a terrorist. By the way, if we include the people who are drunk themselves, all of the health issues and stuff, we have 70,000 deaths in a single year. And the aforementioned diabetes, terrorist attack to diabetes, the ratio is about 1 to 1,000. For every person killed in a terrorist attack, there are 1,000 people who die due to diabetes. If we consider the death worldwide in a single year, terrorist attacks make up about 0.05% of those. So terrorism is actually one of the most unlikely causes of death there is. Now, Rosling gives good advice for us on how to deal with this issue. He says we should compare and divide, because a lone number on its own always seems very big and very frightening. Oh, more than 3,000 people dead. However, if we compare this large number with another number, for example, the people who died from terrorist attacks with the people who were killed by drunk people, then we put it into relation, and we notice, oh well, this number isn't actually that big. The other number is way higher. And we can divide. For example, as we just did, we divided, we checked how big is the share of terrorist attacks on the number of deaths worldwide in a single year. And again, we noticed, 0.05%. This isn't such a big share. So this again helped us to put things into perspective. So the media clearly is an area where the availability bias, the availability heuristic fails us. Another issue that arises concerns anecdotes, because due to the availability bias, we tend to emphasize anecdotes over statistics. Now, this is a pretty big topic on its own. There will probably be a video about it at some point in the future. For now, let's have a look at one nice example by Nassim Taleb from the Black Swan. He tells the following story. We are on a plane to New York, where we would like to spend a long weekend. And next to us, there is an insurance salesman who keeps talking. And he tells us about his cousin with whom he will spend the holidays, and his cousin once worked in a law office and he had a colleague, and the brother-in-law of that colleague had a business partner, and that business partner's twin brother was mugged and killed in Central Park. And that was in 1989, if he remembers correctly, and he was just 38 years old, and he had 3 children, and one of his children had a birth defect, so it required special care, special attention, and now those children don't have a father anymore because he carelessly walked into Central Park. Now, this story will probably be quite vivid in our minds, and when we are in New York, we will probably avoid Central Park. Just to be sure, people are killed there all the time. Now, if we would check an actual crime statistic, we would probably see that the street where our hotel is located is way more dangerous than Central Park, but it will influence our judgment because this anecdote, this story, is more vivid in our minds, is more present than an unspectacular and boring statistic. So the availability bias will not just lead us to wrong conclusions and misjudgments, but it will, of course, also influence our behavior, especially when dealing with risks. There is a nice example, a cycle described by the economist Howard Kunreuter. He says, after a big earthquake in California, people will be very cautious. They will take out insurances against earthquake damage. They will fix their boilers so they can't move. They will seal their cellar doors against water. They will stock up on emergency rations. And they will be overly cautious for a while. And the more time passes, they will be less and less and less cautious until the next earthquake when it spikes up again. So there is a cycle of being excessively cautious, of being appropriately cautious, and of being too careless that repeats after each earthquake. And the availability bias or even influences our opinions. Recall the study I told you about earlier with the people who had to rate their own assertiveness and to rate themselves more or less assertive just depending on those examples they were asked to come up with. One Craig R. Fox performed a nice variation of this experiment with his college students. He asked them to rate his lecture. And one group of students he asked to come up with 2 suggestions for improvements, 2 things they liked about the lecture, and then to rate the lecture overall on a scale. And another part of the students he asked to come up with 10 suggestions for improvements instead of 2. Again, 2 things they liked, and again rating on a scale. And you can probably see where this is going. The students asked to come up with 10 suggestions for improvements. They rated the course much better, much higher than those who were just asked for 2 suggestions. Because they were probably thinking, oh, I can't come up with any more suggestions. The lecturer is probably great as it is already. I have to rate it higher. I have to remember this trick very well. And finally, the availability bias can even lead to conflict. Imagine groups of people such as a couple or a family or people living together or even a team at work. And now you take such a group and you speak to each person individually and you ask them, how big is your contribution? For example, to housework, to grocery shopping, to taking out the trash, to taking meeting notes, to whatever, caring for the children, and so on. And you ask them for a percentage. And you do this with all the members of this household team or whatever. In the end, you add together the numbers. In theory, you should get about 100%. Actually, you will get a number that is way higher because our own contributions are more present to us, more vivid in our minds than things done by other people for us. So we will overestimate our own contributions. Now, obviously, if you have a group of people living together and everyone believes, yeah, I contribute a lot, but the other people are all lazy, this is bound to lead to conflict. This isn't an entirely self-serving effect, by the way. You will get the same effect if you ask, for example, how often do you cause an argument or something like that. There, people will overestimate their own contributions as well. Some final remarks. There is a big spectrum, a wide range of biases and fallacies. Some we have already discussed on the channel, others we will discuss in the future. There is a wide selection. and especially with biases such as the availability bias that are very basic and fundamental and simple, it is often difficult to clearly distinguish. Imagine, for example, a couple you know has just married and you are wondering whether this marriage will last or whether they will be divorced later. Now, unconsciously, your mind will try to come up with examples for other couples you know that have been divorced, which is the availability bias at work. But you probably won't stop at that, but you will also unconsciously try to figure out how similar is this specific couple I am thinking about to those other couples that have been divorced that I recalled. So, representativeness is also an important factor. Or you might take a different route. You might unconsciously wonder which would be possible reasons for this couple to be divorced. And again, you will try to come up with examples. And again, this is the availability bias at work, the availability heuristic. However, again, you probably won't stop there, but you will also wonder how plausible is this as a scenario for this couple? Can I come up with a plausible story of how they will get divorced, of how this marriage will fail? So this plausibility of a possible scenario is also important. As I said, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish, was this effect caused by this bias or by that one, or probably by a combination of the two. So you have to keep that in mind. Since the availability bias is such a basic and important bias, it appears in pretty much every source on the subject. It appears in all we have discussed here. Of course, it is mentioned in Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, since he was one of the people who discovered it. I mentioned the Black Swan, I mentioned factfulness. It also appears in Nudge, and it also appears in The Art of Thinking Clearly. Pretty much every list of biases and fallacies will mention the availability bias because, as I said, it's such a fundamental one. And of course, it has a wide range of effects, and it is relevant in a lot of areas. And I surely didn't mention all of them in this video. There are certainly many more. Well, that's it for today. I hope you can easily come up with plenty of good reasons to subscribe to the channel and to give the video a like. We will see each other again next week. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.